A black man is stopped by a police officer, who immediately accuses him of being involved in a crime. The officer, judging him based on his appearance, begins to frame him for a robbery he didn't commit, all while mocking him with every word. What the officer doesn't know is that this man is far more than what he seems. His calm demeanor hides an unexpected truth that will shake the officer to his core. When the officer learns the man's profession, everything changes in an instant. What happens next will leave you questioning assumptions and biases, and how easily power can shift. It was just another ordinary afternoon in the city, as the black man, dressed casually yet confidently, drove through the busy streets. He wasn't in a rush, just heading home after a long day of work. His car was modest, nothing extravagant, yet it served him well. He had a few things on his mind, but nothing that would prepare him for the encounter that was about to unfold. As he approached an intersection, the flashing lights of a police car appeared behind him. He sighed, briefly checking his mirrors and preparing to pull over. It wasn't unusual for him to get stopped every now and then, but today felt different. As he slowed down and parked on the side of the road, the officer's vehicle pulled up behind his, and the officer stepped out with a stern look on his face. The officer was tall, wearing the familiar blue uniform, with his gun belt strapped tightly around his waist. His posture was rigid, and there was something in his demeanor that screamed authority. He walked toward the man's vehicle, eyes scanning him with a look of suspicion. As he reached the window, he immediately barked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" The man, trying to remain calm, answered truthfully, "No, officer." "I'm not sure what this is about." The officer, without giving the man much time to speak, leaned in closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, looking at the man with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. "I bet you've got a criminal record, huh?" The black man felt his stomach twist. He hadn't expected this level of hostility, and he certainly hadn't expected the officer to make assumptions so quickly based on his appearance. Despite the officer's harsh tone and clear bias, the man kept his composure, not allowing the officer's assumptions to throw him off. Little did the officer know, this encounter would soon turn into one of the most eye-opening moments of his life. A black man is stopped by a police officer, who immediately accuses him of being involved in a crime. The officer, judging him based on his appearance, begins to frame him for a robbery he didn't commit, all while mocking him with every word. What the officer doesn't know is that this man is far more than what he seems. His calm demeanor hides an unexpected truth that will shake the officer to his core. When the officer learns the man's profession, everything changes in an instant. What happens next will leave you questioning assumptions and biases, and how easily power can shift. It was just another ordinary afternoon in the city, as the black man, dressed casually yet confidently, drove through the busy streets. He wasn't in a rush, just heading home after a long day of work. His car was modest, nothing extravagant, yet it served him well. He had a few things on his mind, but nothing that would prepare him for the encounter that was about to unfold. As he approached an intersection, the flashing lights of a police car appeared behind him. He sighed, briefly checking his mirrors and preparing to pull over. It wasn't unusual for him to get stopped every now and then, but today felt different. As he slowed down and parked on the side of the road, the officer's vehicle pulled up behind his, and the officer stepped out with a stern look on his face. The officer was tall, wearing the familiar blue uniform, with his gun belt strapped tightly around his waist. His posture was rigid, and there was something in his demeanor that screamed authority. He walked toward the man's vehicle, eyes scanning him with a look of suspicion. As he reached the window, he immediately barked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" The man, trying to remain calm, answered truthfully, "No, officer. I'm not sure what this is about." The officer, without giving the man much time to speak, leaned in closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, looking at the man with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. "I bet you've got a criminal record, huh?" The black man felt his stomach twist. He hadn't expected this level of hostility, and he certainly hadn't expected the officer to make assumptions so quickly, based on his appearance. Despite the officer's harsh tone and clear bias, the man kept his composure, not allowing the officer's assumptions to throw him off. Little did the officer know, this encounter would soon turn into one of the most eye-opening moments of his life. The officer's gaze didn't leave the black man's face as he stood there, hands on his hips. He sized him up, and without hesitation, made his assumptions. The officer's tone was sharp, his words dripping with condescension. "I've seen your type around here before," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "People like you usually don't belong in places like this. What are you really doing here?" The black man's mind raced, but he refused to let the officer's hostility take control. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, being judged based on the color of his skin, assumptions made based on nothing more than appearances. He knew better than to let this moment escalate, so he stayed calm. He could feel the officer's judgment settling on him, but he wasn't going to let it affect him. "I'm just driving home, officer," the man replied, keeping his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't listen. He stepped closer, leaning over the car window, his breath smelling of coffee. "Yeah, sure. You're telling me you haven't been involved in any kind of illegal activity?" He paused, glancing at his partner, who was standing a few feet away, observing the interaction. "Let's be honest here," the officer continued. "I think we both know what's going on. You look like you've been up to no good." The black man felt his anger rising, but he stayed composed. "I'm telling you, officer, I haven't done anything. I'm not who you think I am." The officer's skepticism grew stronger, his assumptions cemented. "Uh-huh," he muttered. "Tell me this. Why should I believe you? People like you don't exactly fit in with the people who live around here. Maybe we should run a quick background check. See if your story checks out." The officer was now not just assuming guilt, but actively treating the black man as though he were a criminal. The man could feel the heat rising, but he didn't raise his voice. He wasn't going to let the officer get under his skin. "I don't have time for this," the man said, looking directly into the officer's eyes. "You're making assumptions based on my appearance, and that's not right. If you want to check, fine, but I'm not the person you're looking for." The officer, still unyielding, pulled out his radio and requested a background check. As he waited for a response, he continued to circle the man, his eyes constantly scanning for something to accuse him of. It was a familiar tactic. This officer wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in finding fault, no matter what it took. As the radio crackled, the officer's partner joined the conversation, his tone casual but skeptical. "You think we should really bother with this one? He doesn't look like the type who's got a clean record," the officer scoffed. "That's exactly what they always say. People like him think they can just get away with things. He's up to something." He nodded towards the black man, who stood there, his patience running thin. Finally, the background check came through. The officer's eyes scanned the screen, his face unreadable. He was expecting to find something to justify his treatment of the man. He frowned slightly as the details registered. Nothing criminal, no previous offenses, just a regular man with a clean record. But before he could say anything, the black man spoke again, his voice calm, but with an underlying firmness. "I don't know why you're treating me like this. I'm not a criminal. I'm a professional, and this is embarrassing." The officer's expression wavered for a moment. Something in the way the man spoke seemed to catch his attention. The black man's poise, his confidence. It was clear that this wasn't the reaction he was used to getting. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. In fact, it made him uncomfortable. "You're a professional, huh?" the officer asked, his tone softer now, though still skeptical. "What kind of professional?" The man paused, not wanting to escalate things, but feeling the need to make it clear who he was. "I'm a surgeon," he said calmly. "I work at the local hospital, saving lives. You've been treating me like I'm a criminal because of the way I look, but I'm not the person you think I am." The officer blinked, clearly taken aback by the response. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. The man had just revealed that he wasn't just anyone. He was someone with power, respect, and a role that required a high level of trust. The officer had made an assumption based on the color of his skin, and now, faced with the man's profession, he was forced to confront his own biases. The younger officer, who had been silent up until this point, spoke up, his voice quieter now. "Wait, you're a surgeon? Are you serious?" The black man nodded. "Yes, I am. And I've worked hard to get to where I am. It's not okay to judge me, or anyone, based on how they look or sound." The officer stood there, unsure of how to respond. The arrogant confidence he had shown earlier now seemed hollow. He had accused the man without cause, and now the man was teaching him a valuable lesson about the consequences of prejudice. The black man didn't say anything further. He simply stood there, waiting for the officer to come to terms with what had just transpired. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Now, it was the officer who was uncomfortable, and the man who had the upper hand. The officer stood there, dumbfounded, staring at the black man as if the words hadn't quite sunk in, and raced as he tried to process the revelation. He couldn't reconcile the image of the calm, composed man before him with the criminal he had so quickly assumed to be. For a moment, the officer opened his mouth, about to say something, but nothing came out. His partner, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, stepped forward, still skeptical. "Wait, you're serious?" he asked, glancing between his partner and the man. "He's a surgeon?" The black man nodded slowly, his expression still firm but patient. "Yes, I am," he said. "And the way you've treated me today is wrong. I've worked hard to become who I am. I didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal just because of the way I look." The officer's jaw tightened, but there was no way for him to hide the embarrassment on his face. He had assumed the worst without any justification, and now he was being confronted with the truth. He had treated the man with disrespect, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to weigh on him. "What's your name, sir?" the officer finally asked, his voice quieter now, a far cry from the arrogance he had shown earlier. "Dr. William Jameson," the man replied calmly, still holding his ground. "I perform surgeries at St. Mary's Hospital." For a brief moment, the officers stood in silence. The shift in power was undeniable. The officer who had mocked the man's appearance now looked down, clearly regretful. It wasn't just the fact that the black man was a surgeon that had thrown him off. It was the realization that he had been so quick to judge, to treat him as a threat, simply because of his race. I'm sorry," the officer muttered, his words trailing off as he tried to find the right thing to say. But he was caught in the weight of his own actions, and the apology sounded empty even to his own ears. "I understand you're apologizing," the black man responded, his tone unwavering. But an apology isn't enough. You need to change the way you look at people, how you treat them based on who you think they are rather than who they really are. The older officer, still standing with his arms crossed, swallowed hard, his embarrassment now palpable. "I'm sorry for what happened," he finally muttered, his words barely audible. "This won't happen again." The black man took a deep breath, holding back the urge to respond angrily. He knew the officer's apology was the first step, but there was more work to be done. "I hope that's true," he said quietly, "but you need to realize that change takes more than an apology. It takes action." Before the officers could the officer opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, a voice interrupted from behind. "You've treated him this way because of how he looks." A bystander had stepped forward. A woman who had been walking nearby had witnessed the entire exchange. She crossed her arms and looked at the officers, her voice filled with disbelief. "That's unacceptable." The officers exchanged certain glances, but the woman didn't back down. "People like him shouldn't have to prove themselves to you just to be treated with respect. The fact that you didn't even stop to consider his humanity is a problem." The younger officer, who had remained quiet up until this point, seemed to be processing the situation in a way his senior partner hadn't. He glanced at the black man again, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to regret. I didn't know," the younger officer said, his voice softer now, his earlier mockery absent. "I didn't realize who you were." The black man nodded, still composed. "That's the point. You didn't stop to ask. You assumed based on how I look." The older officer, still standing with his arms crossed, swallowed hard, his embarrassment now palpable. "I'm sorry for what happened," he finally muttered, his words barely audible. "This won't happen again." The black man took a deep breath, holding back the urge to respond angrily. He knew the officer's apology was the first step, but there was more work to be done. "I hope that's true," he said quietly. "But you need to realize that change takes more than an apology. It takes action." Before the officers could respond, the black man turned and started to walk away. He didn't need to engage further. His calm, collected presence had already made its point. Later that day, the encounter would take on a life of its own. A bystander had filmed the interaction, and soon the video was circulating online. It wasn't long before the story became a trending topic. People shared the video, expressing outrage at how the officer had treated the black man. The video sparked widespread discussion on social media, drawing attention to racial profiling, assumptions made about people based on their appearance, and the impact of those biases on day-to-day interactions. The local police department quickly came under fire. The officers involved were placed under investigation, and the department issued a public apology. They promised to review their internal training and hold their officers accountable for any instances of discrimination. But the real pressure came from the public. Community leaders, civil rights groups, and concerned citizens demanded more than just an apology. They wanted change. The black man, Dr. William Jameson, used the situation to advocate for change. He appeared on news programs explaining how his experience wasn't an isolated incident. He spoke about racial profiling, the dangers of unconscious bias, and the need for reform in law enforcement. He had become a voice for the countless individuals who had been judged unfairly simply because of their appearance or background. But the story didn't end there. The officers, especially the senior one, found themselves under intense scrutiny. The public response wasn't just about the man's mistreatment. It was about how systemic biases had infiltrated their interactions with the public. The video went viral, and the consequences of the officer's actions were felt far beyond the streets of the city. The ripple effect of this one interaction forced the police department and society at large to confront how biases, both implicit and explicit, affected their daily actions. In the days following the viral video, the police department quickly realized the gravity of the situation. What began as a routine traffic stop, where a black man was framed unjustly by a racist officer, had now snowballed into a national conversation about racial profiling, bias, and the abuse of power. The black man, Dr. William Jameson, who had been the target of this prejudice, became an unexpected but powerful voice for justice and equality. The officer involved, initially firm in his misguided beliefs, had been forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Public outrage grew, and the pressure on the department became overwhelming. Civil rights groups, activists, and concerned citizens were demanding accountability, not just for the officer, but for the system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The police department's response was swift. The officer was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. An independent review board was brought in to assess the department's practices, with a special focus on training procedures around racial bias and cultural sensitivity. The black man's calm handling of the situation and his insistence on justice had forced the department into action, while the officer faced the brunt of the consequences: suspension, further training, and public scrutiny. The larger issue remained: how deep did this problem go? The video had not only revealed the officer's individual bias, but it also shed light on the larger systemic issue that pervaded law enforcement agencies across the country. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of discriminatory practices that had affected countless individuals, especially people of color. For Dr. Jameson, the incident was not about seeking revenge or personal gain. It was about making a difference. He didn't want to see another person treated like he had been. He didn't want the same story to be repeated over and over again. His voice became a catalyst for reform, and he used his platform as a respected surgeon to advocate for change within law enforcement. As the public learned more about the story, they began to rally behind Dr. Jameson. His dignified response to the officer's bias made him a hero for many. He wasn't just a victim of racial profiling. He was a symbol of resilience and grace. He stood tall in the face of adversity, refusing to let the officer's assumptions define him or his worth. His calm demeanor in the face of injustice became a model for how to handle such situations, and his words resonated with people everywhere. "I'm not special," Dr. Jameson said in an interview shortly after the incident. "What happened to me happens to countless people every day. It's just that I've had the opportunity to stand up and be heard. This isn't just my story. It's a story for all those who've been unjustly judged. We have to fight for change, and we have to start by recognizing our own biases and assumptions." His message resonated deeply, not just with people of color, but with people of all backgrounds who had witnessed the discrimination he faced. The story went far beyond one man's encounter with the police. It sparked a conversation about how law enforcement interacts with marginalized communities and how society as a whole needs to reckon with the biases that shape their views. The officer involved, while apologetic in private, struggled to reconcile the man he had wrongly accused with the truth that was now evident to everyone. His regret was apparent, but it couldn't undo the harm he had caused. The apology he gave to Dr. Jameson, though sincere, couldn't repair the damage done by his assumptions. The damage wasn't just about the officer's actions. It was about the cultural mindset that allowed such bias to go unchecked in the first place. Over the following weeks, Dr. Jameson became more involved in efforts to address racial bias within law enforcement. He met with local leaders and law enforcement officials to discuss what needed to change. The public demanded reforms, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of training, awareness, and accountability. The police department began implementing new measures: mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, community outreach programs, and deeper scrutiny of the department's practices. Despite the positive changes that were set into motion, Dr. Jameson was the first to admit that real change takes time. The video and the incident may have sparked immediate reactions, but the work to transform a system that had allowed racial bias to take root for so long would take sustained effort from everyone involved. Dr. Jameson didn't expect overnight change, but he was committed to using his platform to see the reforms through. The impact of this story spread far beyond the city where it began. It became a key moment in the ongoing fight for justice and equality. People from all over the country began sharing their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination. The conversation that the incident sparked didn't just center around law enforcement. It spilled over into other areas of society. It reminded people of the power of standing up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's hard. The lesson Dr. Jameson imparted was clear. Bias and discrimination have real consequences, but so does standing up against them. In an age where systemic racism continues to pervade many aspects of life, his story became an example of how individuals can use their voice to challenge the status quo and create meaningful change. His actions demonstrated that no matter who you are, you have the power to speak out, to make your voice heard, and to fight for a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Dr. Jameson's story isn't just about one man standing up for his rights. It's a story of hope, resilience, and the fight against discrimination. His calm, measured response in the face of racial profiling taught us all a valuable lesson. Our worth isn't defined by how others perceive us, and no one should be judged based on appearance alone. In this moment of tension, Dr. Jameson not only challenged the officer's bias, but also set the stage for broader conversations about systemic racism and bias in our communities, particularly within law enforcement. His actions were a catalyst for change, showing that when one person stands up, it can spark a wave of transformation. The changes that followed, new policies, training, and greater awareness, are a direct result of Dr. Jameson's courage to speak out against injustice. What about you? Have you ever faced bias or been treated unfairly because of the way you look or where you come from? How did you handle it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below and join the conversation. If Dr. Jameson's story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about standing up for what's right, challenging biases, and fighting for a fairer world. Together, we can make a difference, one voice at a time. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that inspire change and promote equality for all.